What's going on, everybody? It's Chris from Out West with Chris, talking to you today on behalf of KastKing. Some of you guys know the KastKing brand pretty well, and KastKing is really well known for some really nice reels, fishing reels, spinning, and bait casting reels. They got their start in the fishing industry by making fishing line, and they have a broad assortment of lines that you can choose from, ranging from numerous types of braid to monofilament, and my personal favorite, which is the fluorocoat, and that is a fluorocarbon coated copolymer fishing line. I use that a lot for trout fishing and also for bass fishing. If you're anything like me, you get a new reel in, or maybe you're doing maintenance and you're taking off some old line, and you start thinking, okay, what should I spool on this reel? Should it be a fluorocarbon? Should it be a monofilament? Should it be braid? What should I do? So I wanted to give you 5 things to think about when you guys are getting ready to spool up some line on a reel that will help you make that decision. So the first thing you need to consider is, what species of fish are you going to be targeting? Now this is going to play a role in your line size. So what pound test it is. If you're fishing for crappie or bluegill, you're probably not going to use a 40-pound test line. There's no need for it. You're probably going to be using something in the 4 to 6 pound test range. And you're probably going to want something that is going to get that little tiny jig head, if you're using a jig, down in the water a little bit quicker. Now if you're fishing for bass, there's all sorts of options for line. Whether it's braid for certain applications, fluorocarbon for certain, and monofilament for certain applications. Now if you're fishing for trout, you're probably not going to use a braided fishing line. You might use a braid as a backing and then some fluorocarbon line as a leader, just to save the cost of spooling up a whole reel with fluorocarbon. Fish like trout are often really picky, and they will often follow a lure or inspect a lure for quite a while before they commit to striking. A lot of trout can often be line shy, so you're gonna want to pay attention to that, and you're probably gonna want to use a diameter of line that's not gonna be really visible in the water. If you're fishing for redfish or black drum or Hatteras blue, on the East Coast and the intercoastal waterways, you're probably gonna want a thicker line. Those fish are strong fish. In some cases those fish have teeth that you need to contend with. So you need to be considerate of those species that you're targeting, how they approach the lure, how they make a decision whether or not to strike, and also some of their features like teeth and their strength. So the second thing you need to consider is the water you're fishing in. If you're fishing in really muddy water, odds are fish aren't gonna have the opportunity sometimes to really inspect the bait. They're gonna be more reactionary. So using a braided line in a muddy water or a thicker line in muddy water isn't gonna be as big of a deal as opposed to using a thicker line or braided line in gin clear water. Say you're fishing for bass in a gin clear lake. You might need to go to a 6-pound test line, and you might not be totally comfortable with that. You might be worried that that line will break. Now, that's the situation where you really need to take into consideration the drag on your reel. The function of the drag on your reel is to allow the fish to move, allow the fish to run, just enough that it's not gonna break your line. You might have to work that fish a little bit, which will make for an exciting fight, but you might have to work it a little bit if you're using a smaller test line. But it should pay dividends in more bites if you're fishing really crystal clear, gin clear water using a line size that's smaller. So that is a consideration as well. If you're fishing in a waterway that has a current and you need to get a bait down in the current, you're gonna wanna use something that sinks. Monofilament, it doesn't sink. It really doesn't sink too much. So a fluorocarbon line, in my case the fluorocoat, it actually sinks, okay? So it's gonna help assist your lure, your bait, or whatever get down into the strike zone a little bit faster in a moving current. So that's something to consider as well. The next thing we need to consider is stretch versus no stretch. Some lines, like a monofilament, they have some stretch in them, in the line itself, and that's actually a good characteristic to have in some situations. Now other lines have less stretch. Your fluorocarbon has less stretch, your braid has almost zero stretch, and that is something you want in certain situations as well. in some situations you don't want your line to stretch. If you're fishing a frog on top water, you typically want to use braid. You don't want to use monofilament. You don't want a lot of stretch. And the primary reason for that is so you can get a good hook set when that fish takes it under, okay? So the fish slams your frog, takes it under, you wait a second, roll up any slack, and then boom, you want to set that hook, and you don't want a bunch of stretch. You want to drive that hook through the mouth or the lip or whatever of that fish, of that bass. Situations where you do want some stretch are situations where you're fishing like a treble hook, or you're fishing for a species that has maybe a soft flesh mouth, doesn't have a lot of bone in there. You want that to stretch a little bit so that when you set that hook, it doesn't tear out of the fish's mouth. Situations like fishing a crankbait. Crankbaits, 9 times out of 10, well, 99% of the time, if I'm fishing a crankbait, I'm gonna be using a monofilament line. Because when that fish hits, a lot of times it'll strike from the side. You don't want to just rip that right out of the mouth. Another situation when I typically use a monofilament line because of its stretch is if I'm walking a dog, so using like a spook or something like that on topwater. Again, those have treble hooks. You don't want to rip that out of the mouth. And for me personally, it's also seems a little bit easier to walk the dog with a line that has some stretch in it. Jerk baits are also a little bit easier for me with monofilament. I feel like I get a little bit better action with a line that does have some stretch to it on my jerk baits. Number 4, the fourth thing that we need to cover is the environment that you're fishing in. If you're fishing in an area that has a lot of like really sharp rocky ledges or terrain, or you're fishing in an area that has like zebra mussels or oyster beds or something like that, you're gonna want a line that's abrasion resistant. Fluorocarbon tends to kind of shine in this area. It's a pretty hard material actually. So it has a little bit more abrasion resistance than a monofilament will. Now, if you're fishing really heavy cover, like if you're punching a mat or flipping toolies, something like that for bass, then you're probably gonna wanna go with a braided line. Where I fish, I typically fish with a 65-pound braid anytime that I'm gonna be punching something. If I'm flipping, I'll often flip with a 65-pound braid as well, just because I wanna know that if I get a fish on and it is in the weeds, like choked in the weeds, it's not gonna come off due to a line failure or a knot failure. As long as I got a good hook set, that fish is gonna come off when I grab it and take the hook out, okay? And my insurance policy there is a really solid 65-pound braid. I've used the Fortis braid from KastKing for punching. I also use the Super Power braid from KastKing for punching. Those are great braids to use, but a braided line in general is gonna be great for punching and flipping and those types of applications where you're actually in the cover. So now that we've talked about the characteristics of the fish and the fisheries you'll be fishing for those fish in, gosh, that was a long way to say that. Let's now talk about the characteristics of each of the line types, good and bad, that you need to consider. And this is number 5. First, let's talk about braid. Braid is very abrasion resistant. It's strong. It's a smaller diameter for its strength. So for example, if you have a 20-pound monofilament, it's gonna be a larger diameter than a 20-pound braid. Now, a couple of drawbacks to braid are visibility. Braid is not for fishing for line-shy fish. If you are fishing for a species or you're in a fishery where those fish are extremely line-shy, it's not gonna work. It's not gonna be a great finesse application just because the fish are gonna come up, inspect the bait, they're gonna see that braid, and they could spook off. Areas that braid does excel are using it as a backing for like a fluorocarbon leader material and also using it for punching. Braid does cast really well, so there is that benefit, especially off of a baitcaster. One great thing about braid is there's virtually no memory. There's absolutely no memory to braid, so you don't get that funky coil that you get with monofilament sometimes. So that is a pretty good benefit. One of the drawbacks to braid is that it will slip on your spool. So a lot of times what I do is if I'm gonna spool on a bunch of braid, I'll actually tie on first some monofilament line and then connect line to line with a uni to uni knot or something like that, just so I don't have that slip on the spool. Okay, so now let's talk about monofilament. Monofilament is probably the least abrasion resistant line that you can get of the 3 main line types. Now that stretch factor in monofilament line is great in some situations, especially crankbaits. Crankbaits, in my opinion, that's where a monofilament line really does its best work at. A couple of the drawbacks of a monofilament line is it does have some memory. So when you cast out, you'll actually have more line between you and the bait because of the coil. Occasionally, that can be an issue. You might miss a subtle strike. Your bait, because it's a floating line, won't sink as fast, and you won't have that sensitive connection to the end of the bait. But monofilament's not a bad line. People have fished for monofilament for years and years. And years and years and years. That's what I grew up fishing, and I caught a lot of fish, right? So monofilament's not bad. One of the main things about monofilament is cost. The cost of monofilament is pretty low. All right, so now let's go to fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon has some really great qualities. It is fairly invisible in the water. So if you're fishing really clear water for really picky fish, fluorocarbon can be the way to go. It does sink. So that is a major benefit as well. A drawback to fluorocarbon is a lot of times with fluorocarbon, the knot strength is questionable. There are a lot of knots that you really don't want to tie with a fluorocarbon just because it will pull itself apart essentially. It's not a very supple line, so you do have some issues with that. There's less memory on a fluorocarbon line, which does have some good things to it. You don't have that issue with a coil when you throw out and cast out. You have a shorter distance between your reel and the bait, and not a whole bunch of line you need to take up and that type of thing. Fluorocarbon lines also have a better abrasion resistance than a monofilament line does. It's a pretty hard line. One issue with fluorocarbon is that the line has a tendency to have some issues when you're casting. You can get a lot of wind knots. You can get just issues with the line itself on the spool or coming off the spool. And possibly the biggest drawback to a fluorocarbon line is the cost. That's a little bit more expensive than a monofilament, quite a bit. That's why a lot of guys will use a fluorocarbon leader off of braid if they're using it for finesse fishing. All right guys, that's it for me. Thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope this video was helpful so that next time you go to spool up a reel, you have a good idea of what you want to use it for, so there's no guessing about whether or not you're making the right decision on what type of line you're putting on. I hope you guys have some stuff to think about now so that you can make good decisions on what line you put on. Now in the end, the best line to put on is the line that you got, okay? So go out, have some fun, catch some fish. Thank you guys again for watching. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section down below. Click the thumbs up button. Go check out my channel. And thank you guys for watching on the KastKing channel. Hit that subscribe button if you're new. Thanks again for watching, and thanks for getting out west with Chris.